The impact of the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic is affecting all of us in quite dramatic ways. It's affecting us as individuals, it's affecting us as organizations, it's affecting us as countries. And we're finding ourselves in a position in which we have to rethink some of the most basic aspects of our lives, such as, how do we socialize or not? Or how do we try to keep conducting business the best possible way we can? Another topic that I think is emerging from all this is the idea of practicing leadership in this type of environment, because this is not an environment where we have been before. And that is precisely one of the, I think, issues that we're currently facing. When we plan for the future, we tend to do so based on our past experiences. So those past experiences aren't there because we have not been in this space before. How is it that we can practice leadership in an environment where we just haven't been? And to help us think through this whole concept, we have the honor and pleasure of having Jeff Lawrence with us today. And I have some questions for Jeff, and I am not going to delay things one more second because I really want to hear from him, and that's what we're all here for. So, Jeff, what do leaders, or what do organizations need from their leaders at this point?
Well, hello, Araceli. Thank you very much for having me. I think the first thing we have to do is be clear what we mean by the terminology we're using. And you use three really interesting words there: organization, leader, and leadership. We draw a distinction between leadership and authority, and I think this is a really clear time to make that illustration come to life. Authority is, there's sort of a contract between the people in charge and the rest of the organization. And what the organization is looking for from those people, and for those of you who are in the public utility space or in the regulator space, people are looking to you for three things. They're expecting protection. That is, if they comply with the guidelines and the instructions, then they'll be all right. Second, they're looking for direction. Where is this taking us? And the uncertainty around the coronavirus is one of the most profound effects is we see a lot of people struggling to predict what's going to happen. I'll come back to that idea of prediction as a way to express responsibility a little later. And the third thing that people want from the folks in charge is order, a sense of order, keep things running so we know how to behave, we know how to expect. And that, again, in the days of the virus with this stay-at-home instruction, some more stringent than others, people are really having to reorganize their lives in a way that none of us saw coming. And so that's authority. That's a really important function because humans can't live together without authority structures. So we need those desperately. We need regulation because left to our own devices, I don't think people can behave very well without rules. And so we don't, if you look at a couple of hotspots in the world right now, say Syria or Somalia, you see what happens when the authority structure breaks down. It's chaotic, it's dangerous, we can't survive it. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a whole nother set of things going on that we call leadership. And leadership is really an activity. So one thought I'd like you to rent is, this might not be the time for leadership, particularly if we define leadership as interrupting unproductive patterns in the name of progress. Right now, because we're in a bit of a crisis, we need people need more protection, direction, order. So being very clear, being very transparent, being very communicative, doing what you said you'll do, holding up your consistency and your reliability are really important right now. Now, there are exceptions to that where there might be a hugely dysfunctional piece in your field, where there's some gross inequity or there's some gross unfairness. A crisis sometimes is a great time to take advantage of the usual resistance we get to change doesn't come up in crisis because people are so desperate, they'll try a lot of things. So you may have some breakthrough, but my guess for most of you right now is not the time for leadership. It's the time to use your authority. Now that word leader, I have a little bit of a reaction to because it's actually a term we use to seduce people. Let me tell you how it works, because it's probably happening right now. You may not even be aware of it. In that we say to people, hey, you're a real leader. And by saying that, we can get people to do things that they wouldn't normally do on their own. So I want you to remember that this warning. And when someone says to you, hey, you're a real leader, I want you to ask yourself, what are they trying to get me to do that I'm not likely to do on my own without this invitation? But the danger for us in getting seduced into being the leader is, here I live in the Boston area, and we do this, I don't know, it's a excuse for day drinking thing called ice fishing in the winter. And there's always one person that has to go out on the ice to make sure that the fishing houses and the vehicles and the people will all be safe on the ice. It's a mistake to think it's a good thing to be that person who's always going out on the ice, because what you find is while you're out there checking the ice, everyone else is cheering and encouraging you, but they're all standing on the shore. That's not where you want to be. And so being really sensitive to the use of the word leader is really helpful in these times. So 3 key things. Number 1, it's authority. We need authority right now. We need to calm things down and keep them going. Number 2, leadership is an activity we might take advantage of to make a move that ordinarily we can't talk about because it's too hard, or people aren't open, or people are hunkered down. And number 3, this idea of the word leader as a seduction. I hope that's helpful, Ursula.
Absolutely, of course it is. Yeah, that's a very interesting approach, very interesting thoughts, of course, Jeff, as usual. The idea that while in crisis, it is definitely probably best to try and help people feel some of that direction, order, and protection under authority. So I have another question that I think is quite relevant to the topic right now. We're in an environment in which a lot of organizations are having to share tons of information. They have to interact on a very regular basis. So we have regulators, given what's going on with the pandemic, regulators and industry probably have to be interacting more than ever before, governments and citizens and so on and so forth. So this is probably more complex than it has been in the past. How does one practice leadership in a situation such as this one, in this very complex environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the challenge is on a couple of fronts. Number 1 is you can't really talk about leadership separated from purpose. And so I think all of us have to think about, what is our purpose? What is the purpose of the organization that we're leading? What is our personal purpose, and how do those 2 align or don't align? My experience is when you're standing in your own purpose, everything in life seems easier. You feel better about what you do, you find more energy, it just seems easier. And when you're standing in someone else's purpose, everything gets harder. So I think this is a really good time for people and organizations to step back and think about, what is our purpose and how is that purpose being served, even in the time of crisis? Because the crisis shouldn't affect your purpose. It may affect the means by which you fulfill it. It may affect the resources you have to fulfill it. It may affect the approach that you take. It doesn't affect the purpose. That's why purpose is so important, because even as an individual, we should be able to rely on our personal purpose to guide us when things get really chaotic, when people, remember, it's not that people dislike change. They're fine with change if they think it's good for them. And they're not fine with it if they think it's bad. And it's not good for them when they think it brings some sort of loss. So we see a lot, we call it the resistance formula. You get pushback from people when the loss you're asking them to take feels greater than the purpose they think it's serving. And so people resisting even what seems like responsible, logical, proper requests, like please don't go outside and mix in groups, seems like a reasonable request at the time of the virus. Some people feel that's too much to ask. They don't want to give up what they'd have to give up to do that, so they're not complying. We even see it at the world leader level. I mean, if we look at, there were 3 examples this week that really struck me. I've been watching Trump's behavior through this, but even Boris Johnson trying to make an announcement in the UK, you can tell the I don't know what the right word is. I don't think it's indecision, but the evasive quality of his speech, because he doesn't want to put a stake in the ground with so many things up in the air. He's trying to remain in the game, viable, something, so he wouldn't utter the word lockdown. Everybody was waiting for the authority figure to say, look, stay at home, you have to stay at home. Now, some of the devolved democracies around them, like Scotland, the First Minister of Scotland, Mary Pope, said, hey, look, stay home, that's it. You know, the Scots are a little more direct than the English anyway. But we also saw in Mexico and in Africa, in Tanzania, we saw world leaders who were really struggling with how do I honor my religion but live up to my public responsibilities. And so in Mexico, López Obrador was calling for, look, the churches can still meet because the virus won't come into the church. We've seen some of that here in America. In Tanzania, they allowed the churches to remain open because they don't think the virus will come into the church. And so we could be critical of those people, but I think of it more as watching individual humans trying to manage the competing commitments of what part of what I believe am I going to put on hold to serve another group of people. And it's a very real human struggle. So as regulators in the public utility space, I think we all have a set of rules we're supposed to follow. And I think a question is going to keep coming up for people. Okay, which rules are we going to sort of nod and a wink, not really follow, and which rules can people really count on? And the more reliable, the more purpose-led reliability we get in times of crisis, the better it is. Because I do want to say something to everybody about the crisis. Think back to the days of the Vietnam War. We had a large number of prisoners of war, many of whom did not survive their imprisonment. The ones who did had one thing in common. They never set a deadline for getting home. The ones who set a deadline didn't tend to make it because it wasn't based on any fact, it was based on hope. And when the deadline came and went, their hope was crushed and their hearts were broken. I think it's a mistake to try to set a deadline about the virus. We just have to remember that we're going to stick through this. And staying in our purpose and staying reliable so people know what they can count on is one of the ways to get through this. And I think that's the way to think about the crisis is we will get through this if we stand in our purpose and we stay on the reliable track that we're on.
Thank you, Jeff. There's so much that you just shared right there. I hope we're going to get lots of, I'm sure we're going to get lots of excellent questions. I do have another question, and it goes back to one of the points that you've already made and the point that you just made just now, talking about those people that stay in the sidelines. Mm-hmm. What do we do to engage those people? Don't know if you have a name for them. I'm going to call them the observers. Yeah. What do we do to engage those people? And how can we ensure that we all do our part, that we all do either, the authority that we need to have perform that, or the leadership that we need to in this time? How do we engage those?
I think the people who stand on the sidelines are a tough group. I mean, part of what we have to look at is to what extent is their own behavior creating observers? Because we know people won't engage in that which they don't co-create. So a lot of times we come to people with an already baked answer and then try to sell them the answer. It's much more effective to engage them in coming up with the answer, then they're part owners of it, then they're off the sidelines. And so coming to people late and saying, you really ought to do this is not it tends to create more observers and less. So I think the first question for each of us is to look at, am I generating opportunities for people to engage, or am I trying to sell my ideas? It's, I would call it the choice between being right, being correct, and being effective. And I don't know about people on the line today, but I have a terrible relationship with being right. It's cost me dearly. And you can tell I'm a consultant, so of course I'm all about being right. But I think it's really a mistake to think that those of us who are in positions of authority are supposed to come up with ideas and then sell them to others. I think that's a very dangerous path to go down. Our responsibility as people in authority is to gather the people and generate the conversation that produces the group solution and moves forward. Not in a consensus way. The problem with consensus, particularly in a crisis, is it gives everybody a veto. So if one person doesn't want to go, it holds up everybody. You can't do that, but you do have to create opportunities for people to voice their ideas, to voice their input, to share their experience, to link up their needs. And if you don't do that, then you're probably, if you have a preponderance of observers, it's probably because they either don't believe or never had an opportunity to contribute. And so in a way, you're contributing to the very problem you're trying to solve by how you're behaving, which is a very common occurrence for most of us who work in human systems.
Wow. All right. Well, I have more questions for you, Jeff, but I think it's time for us to hear from the audience.
Okay.
So if you all have questions, please go ahead and post them on the chat so we can address some of those. Please take advantage of this opportunity having Jeff here. We'd love to hear what comments or questions you may have for him.
This would be the audience participation portion you've heard so much about. So
Yes.
people are typing. I can't see the chat box. So I told Araceli I can't read chat and talk at the same time. So I'm relying on them to relay the questions to me.
Let me ask you a question that popped up here that sounds quite interesting, and it's from Paul Sokiewicz. It says, given the crisis is the time to exercise authority, but in what areas is it appropriate to exercise leadership in the sense of shaking things up?
Well, again, leadership is about interrupting unproductive patterns. So when you see something that is happening that is inappropriate, isn't meeting your purpose, isn't in line, for instance, maybe someone is diverting resources from one of your entities to serve something other than the common good. Stepping up and saying, wait a minute, that diversion isn't appropriate. We never agreed that we're going to step off the path here. And so I want to object to that. That would be an act of leadership in the time of crisis. Most of the time, crisis calls for what we call command and control. You know, you can, we don't want to start, well, I mean, a great way to put it is if you've got people in a movie theater, the fastest way to get them out is to light the movie theater on fire. You don't have to convince people. You don't have to tell them what to do. They get up and run out. The problem with that model is it's really expensive to burn down theaters to empty them. So we'd rather just people get up and leave without the burning. In a crisis, the theater is already on fire. And so getting people to do anything is largely just what we said before. It's a protection direction order. Get them moving. Let's go. We got to go this way. We have to act this way collectively. Leadership is going to be anything else. It takes a look at how do things work. Because remember, every system is perfectly aligned to produce the results it currently produces. The good and the bad, the sharing and the inequity, they're all outcomes of the current system. So some of you involved in these really complex public utility arrangements might see an opportunity here to say, you know what, we've hated this for 20 years. Now with the crisis, maybe we can make this switch over because we don't have to stick with it right now. People will let go of it because they see how stupid it is in this light. That might be an example where you would exercise leadership. Or you may, from studying someone else in a different location, learn that there's another entity that does something that you've always wanted. You guys never figured out a way to do it. And so you might say, well, let's adopt that practice. And I think Araceli is going to ask me about best practice in men, but I'm going to upstage her because it becomes relevant right now. We refer things that work elsewhere as best practices. And the myth of best practice is if I just take a practice from there and plunk it down here, it should work like it does there, which isn't ever true. No two organizations, no two locations, no two groups of people are exactly alike. So what we want to do is think about next practice. What are the things that work that we might try here that we might adapt to our circumstance, given who we are, where we are, what our history is, what we believe in, and take a kernel of the idea and adapt it to our circumstance. That's called next practice. That's what I want you to be thinking about, is what can I learn from others that I could then adapt to my circumstance and help people whom I am designated, dedicated, sworn to support.
Yeah. Let me ask you, since we're on that topic, Jeff, as well. Next practice sounds somewhat risky. I hear our participants in our training programs talking on a regular basis about best practices, which in kind of like you touched on that already.
Mm-hmm.
For us, it has a kind of a backward into the past type of look rather than a forward approach. How can we help people do more of that idea of next practice? How can we help them understand that next practice may be about experiments that they need to run and try new things? How can we help them? Because that's not an easy thing to do. There's risk involved.
Absolutely, there's risk involved. I think there's a couple of things we have to do. One is no experimentation will occur in the absence of a holding environment. A holding environment is a sort of vessel. It's the idea people have that the risk they're taking is not all their own. Mm-hmm. So that might be, in some cases, organizations create innovation teams and sort of put them over on the side in a garage so that nobody can see what they're doing, and they're less apt to create concern or panic. Other organizations try a really modest thing that they know is hugely unpopular, they're trying to fix, because people will, again, they'll be less resistant if the purpose we're serving is really attractive to them, even if the loss is a slight inconvenience. But I think most of us would like to do more experimentation, but we don't take the time to create a holding environment. So how are you going to assure, because particularly people in public utilities, I think we find out, hey, we're doing an experiment with the power that comes to your town, is a fairly alarming statement to make. So we have to find ways that we can provide some sort of a vessel, some sort of a holding environment is a term we use, that allows people to experiment without this sort of, if this doesn't work, you're all going to be killed kind of pal hanging over it. That's, people go to best practice because they can use that authority of, hey, this worked over here, so you guys should allow me to do it here. They're doing the same thing. The problem is that the assumption that they can just drop that into our place and make it work here like it did there is part of the problem. Mm-hmm. And so creating the holding environment and then thinking very careful about this idea of experimentation is, in the tech world, they talk about fail early and often. That's not very useful advice to most people in non-tech circumstances. You want to fail, but you want to fail in a controlled way. I think Nelson Mandela said it best. I never lose. I win or I learn. And so every experiment should be a chance to learn something, not to test or, it's not a pass-fail test. It's let's make an assumption. Let's see if the assumption bears out. If it doesn't, we have to have the courage to stop it right away. If it does, then we try to learn what led to that and what's the next step for us to take. And so this idea of going step by step is much less risky and much more conducive to progress than betting on one big, hey, let's bring this practice over and drop it in and hope that everybody can figure it out. And we do it all the time. I mean, we have the hopefulness of the new, medical records, electronic medical records going to change healthcare. I'm drawing a blank right now, but there are 4 or 5 different examples where we thought, oh, well, when that gets here, everything will be fine. And we're doing that a little bit today in the virus. Like when the vaccine comes around, we won't have any more problems. Well, I think we'll have different problems when we have the vaccine. We'll have eliminated one problem is there will be some available protection for some people. But then all the problems of our healthcare system about distribution, about equity, about availability are still going to be there, that having a virus in some city, in some part of the world isn't going to solve. So I do think we need to create a holding environment and then think about running experiments that are a set of assumptions that we test and move forward step by step. I think there's a lot of space there for do more aggressive work than we've been.
Very good. I do have another question from, I think it's Chiara Giovanni. And Mark has a second question following that one of hers. And it says, what about the role of experts and expertise in decision-making by authorities? And Mark would like to add, what conflicting interests and perspectives do people in authority have to balance?
Expertise is a kind of authority. You know, you're considered an expert because people believe you know things and can do things. But they're testing it all the time. I mean, even this morning, I mean, I'm being tested right now. Is this guy really a leadership expert? And so I'm going to meet the expectations of some people on the call, and I'm going to either say something that people disagree with or find beneath what they would call an expert. And so they won't feel that I'm an expert by the end of the call. So expertise is sort of lies in the eyes of the beholder. We'd like to think because I have a PhD, or because I used to work at Google, or because I went to this college or that college, that makes me some sort of unassailable expert. Expertise is only worth what the people who are observing it will make it. You know, they'll either honor your expertise or they won't. And I think it's I don't know, as an expert, I would encourage you to be skeptical of people who rely on expertise, particularly in changing times, because I'm not sure what we could have studied in the past that would have prepared us for what's happening right now. And so authorities need to draw expertise from all kinds of places, but expertise is not only in the sciences, in the human services, it's also expertise in a community. Who knows this community best? Who knows, who could credibly speak for a large part of the constituency that we're trying to serve? That would be expertise as well. And we sometimes discount the informal expertise or informal authority that people have, which is a huge waste of resource. I mean, people who, particularly, it's most commonly overlooked in communities. You know, we think because of the socioeconomic status of a group, that somebody in that group can't really speak for people, can't really articulate what's going on with them. And so we tend to overlook that and make, I would call it patronizing decisions about, we know what's best for you, just go along. As the authority figure, I think you have to think about expertise and understand what is the basis of the credibility of the expertise. Because like in the authority model I told you, if people experience protection, direction, and order, they give you more authority. They give you more power, actually. And if they don't experience that, they're going to take that power away. So as public utilities meet the public need, stay out of the public ire, they tend to have more influence. As they get criticized and blamed for things, they tend to have less. And so everybody's watching what's happening in California to see what happens with a large, complex utility and how you get it to work better than it's working. I'm not being critical, but right now, between the lawsuits and the blame and the public image, they're struggling. And it could happen to any utility who doesn't deliver the services of authority to a group they're trying to serve. That is, the group doesn't feel protected, they don't feel they're being taken somewhere, and there's no rules about how we get along. And it might be your technology is tremendous, but your customer service stinks. So everybody thinks you're a terrible organization because you're not very good at talking to customers. It doesn't say anything about your expertise in delivering power or light or water or anything that you deliver, but that lack of connection to your customer base could undermine your, quote, expertise. So I think the authority figure has to figure out who finds which expertise credible, and the more inputs you can get, now again, you got to keep moving forward, but the more input you can get from diverse sources, the less apt you are to be surprised at the end, which is one of the goals of authority figures, is to reduce the amount of surprise that you experience. When you do things, you might disappoint people, but you don't want to be surprised.
Very good. Excellent. Gosh, Jeff, thank you so much. This is so rich, so much information, and we're all learning so much. I do wonder if, well, we have come up to our time, but we do have a number of questions here that, if that's okay with Rebecca and everybody else running this webinar, I'd like to continue if Jeff has a few more minutes for
I
us.
do.
And yeah,
Let's
excellent.
do rapid fire so people don't have to. I'll be really. These have been long answers. I'll try to make really short answers the next few questions if I can. So you
Oh,
do the
no, that's
wrapping.
fine.
I'll give you a short answer.
We're all enjoying it. I have another, yeah, excellent question here that says the following. It's from our friend Kathleen Revere-Smith, and she's asking, how can regulators get a seat at the table when decision makers are making these decisions that have that have significant impacts on utilities and overall development in the short and medium term? So how can regulators get a seat at the table?
Okay, here's the bad news, Kathleen. You became a regulator because you didn't want to be a politician, I'm guessing. You have to think politically to get a seat at the table. You have to build relationships. You have to provide value to people. You have to work on that until it occurs to them to invite you. The only other choice is to go barreling into the meeting, which I don't recommend because that's what security does. They pick you up and drag you back out again. So I think you have to think politically. What's important to the people who are making those decisions? Who do they listen to? What is it that those people get from them? And how could I be the one that they get that input from so that I have a seat at the table? And frankly, and I talk with people all the time, it's not just regulators. I talk to people all the time who think political is a bad word. Politics is just what people do when the rules are insufficient. That's all. So if you want a seat at the table, you have to figure out how to get in relationship with the people who are at the table. And that's going to cause you to go meet with people, listen more than talk, be nice to some people who are not nice. I'm not asking you to be disingenuous or to betray yourself. I am asking you to get into the game by engaging with the people who are running the game. We call that thinking politically. Right?
I have another question, Jeff, from Sydney that says, in times of crisis, how does a regulator exercise leadership in respect to getting things done that the operator may not want to do based on their own business objective? But as a regulator, you know it is for the greater good.
Well, again, I think it can be a political act. I mean, part of it is probably the most useful advice I ever got is people can tolerate a lot when they feel understood. They can take loss, they can take disappointment, they can even take exclusion if they feel understood. And part of what I think regulators have to do is make sure that the people they work with feel understood. Now, that's not always enough. Sometimes you see the world differently. And where you see the world differently, and it's not a question of understanding, I think you have the same advice I gave to Kathleen, is you got to think politically. What's important to that operator? What are they? In most cases, when we see people in human systems who are acting in ways we would describe as dysfunctional, it usually is some sort of loss avoidance strategy. That is, they're afraid of losing something, losing control, losing dominance, losing the seat at the table. And so their behavior, I think you could watch how the Democrats and the Republicans in the American Congress have really gotten polarized. My perception is, rather than taking a side, it's really they're doing their best to stay in the game, and they believe the safest thing for them to do is to hang together. So they're not really making choices based on what the American people need. They're basing choices on what's going to keep them at the table. And so the same thing's going to work with regulators and operators. Operators are doing what they think they need to do to stay in the game. And so if you really understand them and can find a way to connect what you're trying to do to what they're trying to do, it's much easier. If you can't, Then you need alliances and partners to join you to create pressure in the system, which is an active leadership to move the system and create a different pressure that operators would respond to.
Excellent.
I'm not talking about coercion. I'm talking about overwhelming public opinion, publicity, comparative situations that people can relate to. Those are all forms of pressure you can put on operators.
Very good, very good. Well, thank you so very much, Jeff. This has been amazing. I would love to have a ton more time with you and keep discussing forever. I think we need to be respectful of everybody's times.
Yeah.
But I'm going to, so Rebecca is going to kind of let us be for a moment, and we're going to keep the chat open for all of you to please keep posting things if you're still there. If there is anything else that you would like to see us talking about in these webinars moving forward, we will do our best to try and discuss those issues. Also, we'd love to hear from you about what it is that you may have learned, you know, that in this or any other webinars, or in your own experiences going through this crisis, and you want to share those with others. This would be a great opportunity to do so and put them on the chat as well. And there's just so many more things we'd love to hear from you. What is your greatest leadership challenge at the moment? We'd love to hear that as well. So if you'd be so kind to just post your thoughts, post your questions, let us know about other topics that you may want to hear about as we move forward and as we create more of these webinars. We'd love to hear what you have to tell us. So thank you all very much for your attention. I am going to thank Jeff again very much for helping us today and giving us his time and of course his expertise. Then yes, I think
loss avoidance is an interesting concept. It really is. The amazing thing of, you know, people, as I said before, don't mind change, but they'll do anything they can to avoid loss. And so most dysfunction, I mean, some systems thinkers think there's no such thing as dysfunction, you know, because systems are aligned to produce, perfectly aligned to produce what they do. There's no such thing as dysfunction, but things that don't seem to work like they're supposed to, let's put it that way, usually are the result of somebody trying to avoid some loss of status, loss of control, loss of the things I talked about before. And so it's a really interesting diagnostic question to ask yourself. It's not that useful to ask other people because a lot of times they're not even conscious of the loss avoidance that they're engaged in. I just drew a blank. But it's a really useful diagnostic question to ask, because if you can, you can't make loss go away. And so that's not the ambition, is to reduce or dissipate the loss. It's to help people through the loss. And that's one way to describe the work we're doing now is we've had sort of a loss of almost innocence. You know, we used to take for granted you could go out and buy things when you wanted to. We used to take for granted you could go out and socialize. We used to take for granted we could see family members when we wanted to. And it's interesting to me that now that we're restricted, I can't see my grandson right now, for instance. So we spend a lot of time on FaceTime, and I'm very appreciative of the moment I'm going to get to go see him again. And I'm sure that's being played out in families all across the country, where we kind of took the contact for granted, and now it's been taken away. And so that loss is getting us to rethink how we feel about family members and what practices we're going to have around family members. And it could be that, you know, once this is over, we're going to return back to the norm, which is we're busy and assuming that we can do what we want when we want to, and nothing will change. But I have a feeling there's a new normal that's going to emerge about how we congregate socially, how we what we'll do to either avoid crowding together, or what we're going to do because we don't have a choice and have to crowd together. But I don't think life's ever going to be quite the same. And so that thinking about when you watch someone across the table acting what seems to be illogically, like they're acting in a way that's not even in their interest, you should really try to figure out what is the loss that they're so desperate to avoid. There's a guy named Bob Keegan at Harvard who studies adult learning, and he discovered that each of us has what's called an immune system. And it's not an immunity to disease, it's an immunity from change. Now, it's not this is not a handicap or something. It's a very useful thing, because many of you, you're very successful people, your immune system has gotten you to perform at a very high level on a consistent basis. But the people I work with who come to my seminars and that I consult with have come to me and said, I want to be better, I want to be different. And so we have to investigate that immune system to help them rise above the current level they've been able to reach. And some of it is all about helping them discover what's the potential loss that's holding you in the current behavior pattern, particularly when the current behavior doesn't match with what's most important to you. It happens all the time to people. And so we all experience that individually, and collectively we do as well. So when you see, it's most useful to me when I see people that think like, I can't believe these folks are holding out for that, this or that. Figuring out what the loss is behind that is very revealing about how to deal with people in those circumstances.